This is Ask the Governor with Louisiana Governor John Bel Edwards. It's your chance to speak with Governor Edwards and ask questions that are important to you. The phone number is 877-217-5757. This is Ask the Governor on the Louisiana Radio Network.
Good afternoon. I'm Jim Inkster, your moderator, and Governor John Bel Edwards is in the House for his 15th installment of Ask the Governor, and your number again is 877-217-5757. At least 17 million people are under a tropical storm warning from Texas to the Alabama-Florida border. And by tomorrow morning, the storm could bring up to 12 inches of rain to parts of southeastern Louisiana. Governor John Bel Edwards is here to talk about this and much more. And let's start there, Governor. As far as Tropical Storm Cindy, it's an uncertain situation.
Well, it is. And of course, we benefit greatly from all the advances in technology and the way they can forecast these storms. But at the end of the day, we're not in control, and we can't predict with the precision that we would want. What I'm trying to make sure people understand is that this is a storm that's going to impact the vast majority of our state. It's not just southeast or southwest of Louisiana. It's not just the coast. And, of course, last year we had two severe weather events involving rain and flooding, neither of which were even named storms. And so we always have to be prepared for the worst and hope and pray for the best. But this is, by all accounts, going to be a rain and flood event, not so much wind, although there is a chance for tornadoes. In fact, there's a tornado watch over much of the state right now. At any time you have saturated ground and you have high winds, and winds can be anywhere from 45 to 60 miles an hour, you can certainly have trees that get uprooted and fall. That can cause damage to homes and automobiles and certainly impact people in terms of injuries or death, but it also causes a lot of power outages. But we're looking at flash flooding being the most significant threat, and you can't really predict where that's going to happen in advance. Mm-hmm. But they are talking about rain totals of 8 inches, maybe 12 inches in places. But the one thing we should all remember, in August, the forecast called for 5 to 8 inches of rain. We got 23 inches of rain in 48 hours, and so you can't predict. But one thing that we know is the most of the deaths that were caused by the flood in August were caused because people chose to drive their vehicles on roads that were underwater, and they couldn't tell how deep the water was or how fast the current was, and so we're asking people, make sure they don't do that this time. And they may beat law enforcement and the Department of Transportation to that part of the roadway, so it may not be blocked off. There may not be signage that talks about the water. So if you come across standing water in a roadway, we're asking people not to drive across it.
It appears this may affect much of our state.
Yeah, I don't think there's any question about that. The storm itself, what they've identified as the center of the storm will come onshore in the vicinity of the Texas-Louisiana border at about 1 o'clock tomorrow morning, and it's going to basically travel north from there. The vast majority of the impacts of the storm are going to be out east and northeast of that cone. That's where most of the rain is going to be, it would appear. And so we need people to take this very seriously all over the state of Louisiana. Again, we had that storm last year, especially the one in March. We had record flooding literally in all four corners of the state at one time.
877-217-5757 is your number, toll free. There are a few lines open, and that's unusual for the governor, but we're going to go to the phone line shortly, and he will also talk about what happened in the special session and briefly your thoughts about how that ended.
Well, it ended about as well as it could have from my perspective, but it certainly was a special session that should not have been necessary. It was required because the legislature did not pass a budget, and of course our authority to expend funds ends on June 30th, and so we have to have a budget in place. Ultimately, this past week they passed a budget that was almost identical to the one that they had under consideration at the end of the regular session, and we knew, based on some procedural votes on that last day, that the House of Representatives had a majority that were in support of that budget. They were never given an opportunity to vote on it, and obviously, had they been given that opportunity, the session itself would not have been required. But, I'm mindful that the budget still has a lot of cuts in it. We went into the session needing about $400 million additional revenue to incorporate into the budget if we were going to provide the same services as in the current year. Well, we didn't get any new revenue. But despite that, we were able to fund higher education without a cut from last year. That's the best we've done in 9 years, by the way.
Really?
And when you combine that with a TOPS program that's 100% funded, this is the best budget for higher education in many, many years. And I'm very, very proud of that, because I ran saying we were going to stabilize our support for higher education and minimize tuition and fee increases going forward. And this will be the second year that we've delivered on that. And I think it's extraordinary that we were able to do it under the budget constraints that we had. Now, there are some very significant cuts, particularly to the Department of Health, for example, where we're making deep cuts, and another 6% on average will be cut to our partner hospitals. But we think we can make that work, basically because the Medicaid expansion is working so well and saving so much money in uncompensated care that we're not having to render. So I'm positive about the budget, but mindful that it's still going to be very difficult for many state agencies to deliver their services, and also looking forward to the budget cliff, the fiscal cliff, I should say, that's coming next year.
We'll talk about that as we move along as well. There's a big collision coming a year and 9 days from now at the end of the fiscal year of 2017-18. James in Longview, Texas. You're on Ask the Governor, James. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Jim, and good afternoon, Governor.
Good afternoon.
Anyhow, you've been talking about the upcoming storm, and that's a topic I want to address. Anyhow, since I'm in kind of a border area along the Texas-Louisiana line, I'm also concerned about it. And can you tell me if your office is coordinating with other state officials, like officials in my state, just in case mutual aid might be needed?
James, thanks for the question, and we, in fact, are. The director of my governor's office of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness is James Wascom. He's been in contact with Nim Kidd, who is his counterpart in Texas, who works for Governor Greg Abbott. And in fact, I know that they talked at least once this morning, and there is close collaboration, but especially with that river that forms our border. When the water gets high, it goes both directions, and of course we have I-10 and I-20 in the north as well.
Good afternoon. You're listening to Ask the Governor. Michelle Southern's producing. I'm Jim Easter, your moderator, and Governor John Bell Edwards is the star of the show. And if you'd like to talk with the governor, this is your opportunity. He's here for the full hour. 877-217-5757 is your number. Rachel in Lafayette asked about the commercial activity tax, which was originally proposed and ultimately withdrawn. Why did you decide not to go that direction?
Well, Jim, I didn't decide not to go that direction. One of the big challenges we had this year, because this is the last fiscal session before we reach the fiscal cliff, was to come up with a permanent reform of our budget and tax structure. And that reform needed to add predictability and stability to the revenues of the state of Louisiana, but do so in a fair way. In my estimation, our current structure is unfair, principally because 80% of the corporations in Louisiana pay no income tax. And so this was a measure designed to have those entities pay their fair share by calculating a tax not on the income but on gross receipts that they could not avoid. Ultimately, there were not the votes in the House Ways and Means Committee, and so the author of the bill pulled it rather than have them vote on it, but there's no doubt it was not going to get through the committee. But there were, about 17 bills in front of the committee that actually were based upon the task force report. Not a single one of those bills came out of that committee, and so absolutely no progress was made in terms of addressing that fiscal cliff. And that really was the big failure of this session, because there won't be any better options ahead of us. later this year or next year. The task force report was new in the sense that it was a task force that met last year, but the report itself was relatively old in the sense that it was making the same proposals that we've been seeing for a number of years. And so I'm going to redouble my efforts working with House and Senate leadership and rank and file members, Republicans and Democrats alike, because we got to get this fixed.
Grant in New Orleans. Good afternoon, Grant. You're on Ask the Governor. Hi, Grant.
Yeah, Jim, thanks for taking my call. Governor, I want to first compliment you. I think you're doing a good job and a hard job.
Well, thank you,
I actually
Grant.
sat down the other day and I read the full text of the Legislative Task Force report. I thought it made pretty logical sense. So the one piece of it I wanted to ask you about was this decoupling of the federal tax paid from the state tax on your form. Can you give us a little bit more flavor about that and why that's running into such resistance?
Well, if I understand the question, and by the way, Grant, thank you for calling in. One of the things that the task force has been recommending, and by the way, this is a precept of conservative thought as it relates to taxation, is that wherever possible, you broaden the base and lower rates. And in order to broaden the base in Louisiana so that you can appreciably lower the rates, whether it's corporate income tax or individual income tax, the way you do that is you have to get rid of the deduction of federal tax liability, which we're one of 3 or 4 states that do that in Louisiana, but it's one of the biggest exemptions that we have. And you can't really lower the rates unless you do that. And so, for example, if the voters, and it's in the state constitution, so you have to have a constitutional amendment, allow the voters to do away with that exemption for federal tax liabilities, and then they, in exchange, will get lower rates on their income taxes, both at the corporate and individual level. Our proposal was to go from tax rates of 2%, 4%, and 6% to 1%, 3%, and 5% by doing away with the federal tax exemption for personal income taxes. Now, had we done that, at the end of the day, 90% of individual Louisiana income taxpayers would have seen a lower tax bill as a result. Ultimately, that was one of the many task force proposals that did not get out of the House Ways and Means Committee, and so wasn't able to make it through. But those are the sorts of things that we need to do if we're going to modernize our tax structure, add stability, predictability, and fairness. But you can't lower the rates if you don't broaden the base, and you can't broaden the base if you don't do away with some of these outlier exemptions that we have.
Thank you, Grant. 877-217-5757, your toll-free number, wherever you are. This is Bonnie in Abbeville. Good afternoon, Bonnie. You're on with Governor John Bel Edwards.
Okay, Governor?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. This is concerning a bill that you recently signed about opioid abuse or something.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. This bill, and this is my opinion, sir, it seems to hurt the chronically ill and the chronically people who suffer with chronic pain. And I was recently told by the medical examiner's office in New Orleans that these pain management clinics are a rip-off, and he quoted it.
Well, Ms. Bonnie, thank you for calling in. And certainly the intent of the bill and the way that it's worded, I don't believe that it's going to adversely impact those people suffering from chronic pain, whether they are cancer sufferers or other chronic pain. This has to do with a 7-day limit on opioid prescriptions for first-time patients with acute conditions. And we know that 65% of the people who ultimately get on heroin, for example, they started with prescription opioids. And by limiting the prescription to 7 days, we are trying very hard so to not create the dependency in the first place. But I can tell you that for people in hospice care, for people who are receiving cancer treatment, those folks who have chronic pain, this bill does not apply to them. But it is a best practice that's been developed across the country. We worked extremely hard with folks like the Louisiana State Medical Society. I mean, so this is the premier doctors group in the state of Louisiana. We worked with them. We worked with our pharmacies. This was one of several bills that we got through that I've signed into law that deal with this opioid epidemic, which we have to get under control. A lot of people don't know this, but we have about 120 prescriptions each year for opioids for every 100 people in the state of Louisiana. So there's more prescriptions each year for these painkillers than there are people, and that's not even worse in the country. But we have to crack down on it. There's no reason, for example, if you have a tooth extracted, that you leave with a prescription for 30 days worth of opioids. And I know you think, well, that doesn't happen. Well, it does happen. Maybe not as terribly often, but it actually does. So this 7-day limit, we think, is going to do a lot of good going forward.
And reports indicate that more people now are dying of opioid abuse in the U.S. than they are from gun homicides.
Yeah, and it's heroin, especially heroin that is cut with fentanyl, but also just straight up overdoses on the opioid prescription medicine itself. This is an epidemic that is sweeping the country. We have to do something, and I believe that this particular bill that Bonnie was referring to, which was House Bill 192 by Representative Elena Moreno, in conjunction with Senator Fred Mills's bill, SB 55, which tightens up the prescription monitoring program. And then the Advisory Council on Heroin and Opioid Prevention and Education that Representative Walter Leger created in House Bill 490. Those are the three things that we did to try to deal with opioid abuse in Louisiana, to cut down on the number of people who become dependent upon them and then ultimately die.
Paul in Baton Rouge. Good afternoon, Paul. You're on Ask the Governor.
Right. I'm not near the radio, so I don't know if you covered it already, and I won't be able to hear your answer. But I'm curious about state money for flood relief. We're still waiting.
What about the flood relief process?
Okay. The floods that occurred last year, March and August, we have at this point received about $1.6 billion. The last installment that we got was $51 million, far short of what we were asking. And we're going to be going back in September of this year. But the recovery program is moving forward. We've actually started closing. And by closing, we mean distributing checks now for reimbursement claims. So they're eligible homeowners who may have paid for some or all of the repairs to their homes, and if they qualify, we will reimburse those expenditures. But we also have two rebuilding programs, one where the homeowner manages the program themselves and hires their own contractor. The other one is where the state will actually bring the contractor in and manage that program. In order to access this program, individuals do need to take the survey. It's incredibly important. Right now, we've got well over 26,000 individuals have completed the survey. These are homeowners, and it's important to do that, even if you've made a claim with FEMA, because this is a separate government program. This comes through Housing and Urban Development. It's community development block grant money that we have to spend in accordance with our action plan. And so we need individuals to complete the survey and then the application in order to get into the pipeline for this. But I can tell you that program is moving forward rapidly and making good progress. So I would encourage Paul, and I know he can't listen, but I would encourage encourage Paul to make sure that he takes the survey and contacts the folks who are implementing that program for us, and he can call the governor's office if he needs more information.
877-217-5757 is your number, and Governor, it was a week ago at this time that we were hearing the news that Congressman Scalise had been shot in preparation for the congressional baseball game, and fortunately it appears he's going to recover. It'll be a long process, but I know you have been following that as well.
I have been, and you know what a shame that happened. I'm very thankful, as we all should be, that he's doing much better. We now know that his condition, when he went into the hospital, was probably more serious than we all realized because of the amount of internal bleeding, the damage done to bones, but also to organs, was much more severe than we thought. But he is doing much better. I believe his condition has been upgraded today to fair, and so we're very happy with that. And I know that that many people around the state and around the country have been praying for Representative Scalise, as I have. You know, I think this points to the need for a more civil discourse, and you know, this idea that violence is ever acceptable in our country as a way to settle some sort of a political disagreement or difference. I mean, that's just nonsense, and we have to do better as a people. Public servants, elected public servants, should not live in fear that someone who has a political disagreement with them is going to act on that with violence of the type that impacted Representative Scalise and the other individuals who were shot. And I'll tell you, the accounts that I have heard and seen on TV with respect to those police officers who were at the scene, they were nothing short of heroic either.
This is Jim Inkster. Thank you for joining us. You're listening to Ask the Governor with Governor John Bel Edwards. Michelle Southern is producing, and your number is 877-217-5757. Jim in Baton Rouge. Good afternoon, Jim. You're on with Governor John Bel Edwards.
Well, I was just wondering if you have any advice for law-abiding citizens who have concealed carry permits now to get constitutional carry passed in the House and Senate and signed into law. Thanks.
Jim, thank you for the call. And if I understand your question correctly, you are advocating for, or you want the ability to carry a concealed weapon without having to get the concealed carry permit. You know, I'm quite frankly not sure where that stands. There's been bills that have been introduced in the Louisiana legislature. They've not gotten very far. It is my understanding that the law enforcement community in our state likes the system that we have now, where individuals receive training before they get the permit. But also, part of the requirement of having the permit is if you have a concealed weapon upon your person and you have an interaction with law enforcement, you're required to tell them that you have that concealed weapon. And I think they are more comfortable under those circumstances than if individuals were able to carry without the permit, without the training, without the requirement to disclose the fact that they are carrying. But I know that the bill has been introduced one or more times. It has not advanced through the legislative process, and Jim, I'd have to look a little more into it to get more specific than that.
877-217-5757. We go to New Orleans, and Eric. Good afternoon, Eric. You're on Ask the Governor. Hold tight. Eric, I think we got you now. Eric?
An update.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
You're on the air.
Good afternoon. I wanted to get an update on the film tax credits, if that's going to be reenacted. Thank you.
All right.
Well, the film tax credit is going to remain in existence. Senator Morrell, who is from New Orleans and chairs the Revenue and Fisc Committee in the Senate, offered a bill this year that locks in the cap on that program at $180 million per year, which, if memory serves me, that's about $31 million less than we paid out last year, so there's a savings there. But he did an awful lot of work to try to make sure that we get a much better return on investment to the state for the money that we're spending on the program by creating more of an indigenous industry here, by incentivizing folks to hire more folks and having a permanent presence in Louisiana, and making sure that smaller projects do qualify for the money that's going to be dispensed within the $180 million cap. I can tell you that the industry itself is very supportive of the bill. Many people across the state of Louisiana who are involved either directly or indirectly in the motion picture investor tax credit have contacted me and my office urging me to sign the bill, and that is going to happen.
Sherry in Baton Rouge. Hello, Sherry. You're on the air with Governor Edwards.
Hi, Governor. Thank you for taking my question. I was calling because I know, like, when we're having a storm like this, the National Hurricane Center does more frequent updates with the forecast so that we can kind of keep up with what's going on. But I know in August when we were having the flood, and I started checking the river forecast for the Amite River, they only update the forecast in the morning. And so you have to wait 24 hours before you get a new forecast. You can see the current level, so I know it's all computerized, but the forecast isn't changed more frequently, even during a flood. And I wondered if there was any way that, if there was any talk of having that changed so that we could have a little more information. And I'll take my answer off the air. Thank you.
Well, Sherry, thank you for the call, and that's the first that I've had someone express that concern. And I will look into it, and we'll follow up and see whether either the National Weather Service or maybe the state meteorologist or some other service can update that more often. One of the issues that we had, and I don't know that this impacted things in August or not, but we had a number of our rivers that reached record levels of floods, all-time records, and the gauges were actually they were missing. The floodwaters got so high, the current was so strong that the flood gauges themselves were actually gone, and they weren't able to update more frequently than they were. But we will check on that, Sherry, and I'll try to get an answer. If you'll stay on the line and give Tucker your information, we'll get an answer back to you on that.
877-217-5757. Thank you, Sherry. David in Alexandria. David, good afternoon. You're on Ask the Governor.
Good afternoon. How you doing, Governor? My question is for higher education. I understand that we've had some budget issues for a very long time, and a lot of the colleges have been hurting as far as getting pay raises and such. Is there any plan to try to relieve some of that pain and pressure for our higher education?
Well, David, first of all, it's a great question. One of the principal reasons I ran for governor is because over the previous 8 years, we had reduced states' general fund support to higher education more than any other state in the nation, and the tuition and fees being paid by our students increased more than any other state in the nation. That was a road leading to disaster, in my opinion, and I thought it was time to stabilize our support for higher education, minimize any tuition and fee increases, and then reinvest in higher education over time as we're able to do that. Now, I'm proud. It's a meager accomplishment because we're not funding higher education especially well in Louisiana, but for the first time in 9 years, there is not a cut compared to previous year's funding. So when we go into our new budget year on July 1st, there is no reduction to higher education for the first time in 9 years. TOPS has been fully funded for next year as well. So that's the best we've done in funding of higher education in about 10 years. Now, one of the things that did also pass is some limited fee authority for our institutions of higher education, so that if they want to and get the approval of their management boards, they can increase by up their fees. I don't think you're going to see a lot of that, and where you see it, they're going to be relatively small. But one of the concerns expressed to me by the management board presidents and institution presidents and chancellors is the need to give at least some small pay adjustments to faculty members who have not received them in a long time, because we're not competitive with our sister states anymore on the pay and overall compensation packages that we're offering. So I think you're going to see a move in that regard, and at least that would be my hope and my expectation. That's one of the principal reasons that we needed to stabilize higher education funding.
Chris in Mandeville. Good afternoon, Chris. You're on the air with Governor Edwards.
Thanks for taking my call. I'd like to point out that the Louisiana announced a $29 billion budget, which is what, $10 billion more than it was 15 years ago. We have some of the highest per capita spending in the country. I believe it's 10th. It's the highest in the South. We have the biggest government in the South, more state workers. We have more universities in the other state.
Your response about Chris's concern that we have too much government.
Well, we've got a lot less government than we had. I can tell you that I think we've got 30,000 fewer state employees than we had just several years ago. And if you look at the budget that we have in place starting July 1st, there's a $200 million state general fund reduction from the budget from December of last year. So, you know, I understand his concerns. I'm not sure that his facts are all correct and so forth. But we have state services to deliver. We've got, for example, health care that we have to deliver. We've got kids to educate. I don't think we spend more per capita on higher education than other states. In fact, I believe that is erroneous. But, you know, there's always a debate about the proper size, role, scope of government and how much it should cost. The one thing I know is we're saving $300 million next year, state general fund, because of Medicaid expansion. I know that we've cut well over $500 million out of state government since I've been governor, and we're dealing with these budget constraints in a very balanced way. Certainly not in a way that's going to make everybody happy, and I understand that.
As far as the actual amount of money, we're going to the break, but much of the budget is, of course, federal dollars on a percentage basis.
Yeah, I think the amount of state general fund out of the budget is $9.44 billion. The rest is federal.
877-217-5757 is your number. We're back after this pause with more of Ask the Governor. This is Jim Inkster. Thank you for being with us for Ask the Governor, another segment, and your number is 877-217-5757 for Governor John Bel Edwards, his 15th program. He does this every third Wednesday of the month. And before we go back to the phone lines, as far as one of the major accomplishments of the session, and one that just about everybody agreed upon, depending and not depending on which side of the aisle you're on, criminal justice reform. Your thoughts about what happened in that realm?
Well, we're currently spending over $700 million a year, so right at $750 million each year to have the highest incarceration rate in the nation, and we're not safer as a result. And we were able to put together a tremendous coalition of folks inside the legislature, outside the legislature, from around the state and really around the country, the right and the left, in order to promote criminal justice reform, which I was able to sign into law. It was a package of 10 bills filed by Republicans and Democrats in the House and in the Senate, and that passed overwhelmingly. And going to do some great things, to focus prison beds on those who pose a serious threat to society, and not fill up our prisons with individuals who don't really pose a threat. Those individuals, for example, who may have committed low-level property and drug crimes. But we're also going to strengthen community supervision, make sure that we're more successful in terms of reentry. And then reinvest a substantial portion of the savings into programs to make sure that we're successful, like mental health treatment, substance abuse treatment, training and education. I think it makes sense. The thing that I'm most gratified about is we're not reinventing the wheel. We looked at what other southern conservative states have done over the years, and in order to safely reduce their incarceration rate and save money, and those are the practices that we pursued in this legislative package. So I'm proud of the work that was done in this session on that.
Blanca in Baton Rouge. Good afternoon. You're on with Ask the Governor. Blanca?
How are you?
Fine.
Good. My question is about the survey that you were talking about with the flooding that is happening in Baton Rouge.
Yes, ma'am. Well, it's the flood that happened all over the state of Louisiana, both in March and in August of last year. And you can do that a couple of ways. You can get online and go to restore.la.gov, restore.la.gov to take the survey, or you can call 866-735-2001. 866-735-2001. If you're calling, the lines are going to be open 8 to 6 Monday through Friday. So 2 ways to do that, and I encourage everyone who received any flood damage at all to their homes to go and take that survey.
Thank you, Belanca. 877-217-5757. Still time to get in with Governor Edwards. Let's go to Nell in Lafayette. Hi, Nell. You're on the air with the governor.
Hi, Governor Edwards. Thank you so much for the work you did on criminal justice reform. I think that was smart, and it's wonderful to have something to be proud of this session. But my question is about why we spend so much of our Medicaid budget on nursing homes when there are thousands, I think there's over 30,000 people in the community on waiting lists waiting to get some help in their own homes, which would be cheaper for the state. You have quite rigorous standards for who gets those services.
Well, now, thank you very much for the call, and I share your comments, obviously, your thoughts about the criminal justice reform. With respect to the nursing homes, as you know, that is a tremendous expense for not just Louisiana, but every state in terms of Medicaid. I would point out that a couple of years ago, the voters of Louisiana passed a constitutional amendment that creates a floor, if you will, on the way that nursing homes are reimbursed for the services that they do provide. Now, one of the things that you may be alluding to is a move to long-term managed care, where we would actually have managed care organizations, for example, insurance companies that would be between the state and the providers, in this case the nursing homes, to manage that, and also a move towards making more of the money available to keep people in their homes and in community-based settings longer. I know that there are some states who have had some success in that regard, and some have not. And as I've said before, I'm open to it. I just want to make absolutely sure that before we put an insurance company between the state and the provider, that when we do that, we're not diminishing the amount of money that's actually available to provide services. I think at this point in time, it's a minority of states. I think it's 19 or 20 states out of the 50 that have done that. But it is something that we are looking at, and especially as it relates to individuals who are in nursing homes whose primary diagnosis is a mental illness or a mental condition as opposed to a physical condition. And we're actually working with the nursing homes now on that. I think there's about 4,000 residents who've been identified in that group, and working with the U.S. Attorney General's office as well. So we've got a lot of work to do in that area. And certainly my mind is open, but I want to make sure that we don't move to a system that costs more and inadvertently that costs more and actually provides fewer services.
Was it a setback that a gasoline tax for roads and bridges was not passed?
Well, Jim, I mean, it's a real issue. You've got a gas tax that's been the same for about 30 years. And at 16 cents, the erosion of the purchasing power of the gas tax is now about 7.5 cents. And you just can't do today for 7.5 cents what you did for 30 years ago for 30 cents. For 16 cents. And so it's a real problem because we have certain parts of the state with capacity problems, like here in Baton Rouge, that you just don't have enough capacity, especially on the interstate system and the bridges, to get traffic moving. But all across the state, you have have maintenance needs, you have preservation needs, and we have a lot of old bridges, especially in the rural parts of the state. And I do think we have to move forward. We can't do it with the existing revenue structure that we have. And one of the things I'm most concerned about is we are soon to turn away our federal gas tax dollars because we're not generating the non-federal match here locally that's required to avail yourself of those dollars. So I think we're going to have to do something. We did have a task force that met and studied the needs and came up with a method to go forward. Ultimately, that was not successful in the House. As a result, we're not going to make the kind of progress that we would all like to make. Now, we're not going to sit still either. We're doing everything that we can, but what we can do will be much more limited than I think we really need to get things moving in commerce the way that they should.
If another special session is in the offing, when is it most likely to happen?
You know, Jim, I'm not sure that we're going to have a special session. Obviously, we need one to address the cliff. Because this next session that starts in March of 2018, it is a non-fiscal regular session, so you can't fix the cliff. But I don't want to call a special session if we're going to have the same sort of result that we had in this fiscal session that just concluded, where not a single thing passed the House of Representatives. And so I will be getting with the leadership in the legislature, talking to them and seeing what kind of plans we can agree upon in advance, or whether they even have a plan before I just call a special session.
Ron in Baton Rouge, please be brief. Ron, you're on with Governor Edwards.
So my question is, how do you feel about maybe looking into early release for first offender lifers that have served maybe about 25 years of their time? And
well, Ron, I mean, that's not something that we looked at, and that, quite frankly, I wouldn't want to move in that direction. We went with nonviolent offenders almost exclusively. Now, there are some individuals, juveniles, doing life without parole, who are going to have an opportunity now to have parole consideration. That's because the U.S. Supreme Court told us that we had to do that, and told the entire country that we had to do that. And by the way, I think that's the right thing to do. Not all of those individuals will ultimately be paroled, but they will have some consideration. But we focused on nonviolent offenders in this package of criminal justice reform bills.
Michael and Zachary, please be brief. Michael, you're on with Governor Edwards.
Hi, Governor. I appreciate you talking to me. I'm calling about the criminal justice reforms. It just so happened that I watched the testimony in the Senate over House Bill 1 this last time, and I saw someone who represents probation officers speak, and I saw them a lot in the news, and I'm kind of concerned about the things that will happen to their agency, and it kind of looks like they were hung out to dry.
Well, Michael, I wouldn't say they were hung out to dry. They certainly didn't get the type of raise that they want, and by the way, that they need. If you consider that they're law enforcement officers, they carry a gun, they go to post for certification, and then you just look at the hours that they work and the people that they deal with, they certainly are underpaid, and we need to fix that. And they did get to participate in the overall pay adjustment that's going to be 2%. As we transition to a new system for classified civil servants in the state of Louisiana, a new pay system, the system that ultimately will cost the state less going forward, but that 2% one-time adjustment, they will participate in that. It's not as much as they want. It's probably not as much as they need, but they weren't left completely out to dry, as you said.
Well, thanks for listening and calling, and the governor will be back on July 19th for another Ask the Governor show. Have a good Independence Day, and we will return.